Hi, thank you for joining us today. Today's webinar is for ATARC's Ethics in Responsible AI project team, and we will be hearing from the Joint Artificial Intelligence Center and ForHumanity. So I will go ahead and pass it over to our MC today, Tom Suter, the founder of ATARC.
Hello, everybody. I hope we don't have everybody bleary-eyed after staying up late last night. Good afternoon. I guess technically it is good afternoon, and hope you're having a good day. Really excited about this conversation that we're going to have, and if Alka and Ryan, if you want to come on. I look at one of the things we're trying to address today is something that I see all the time, whether it's in security. And it's really hard to solve a security problem, such as cloud security, until you have some kind of a standard, some kind of a baseline. And we've seen that with mobile security too, NIAP, that's NSA and NIST. So I'm really excited. We're in a very challenging time here with AI ethics. It's like right at the top of the list of the concerns people have with artificial intelligence. And it's going to be really hard, and we've made our way in the world working on AI ethics, but I'm really excited for you to see the approach that Ryan here with ForHumanity's kind of put together. I think it's going to be very interesting, and we're going to have a good discussion today. Definitely send in your questions as this proceeds this afternoon, and we'll take your questions and make it more of a conversation. But without further ado, I will introduce Alka Patel, who works over at the Joint AI Center and basically heads up AI ethics for the Department of Defense there. How are you doing today, Alka?
I'm doing well today, Tom. Thanks so much for having me here today. I appreciate it.
I'll turn it over to you.
Okay. Perfect. Good afternoon, everyone. Really excited to be here with all of you. Special thank you to ATARC for the invitation to speak today and share out some of the journey and the work that we're doing at the DOD and at the JAIC around AI ethics. I think what ATARC does in terms of bringing such diverse and important groups of individuals from industry and academia or government together is really critical, especially as we think about AI ethics and responsible AI and how we move that forward. And especially pleased to be here today with Ryan with ForHumanity. We've had a chance to connect previously, but I think individuals like him and organizations like him are the key for helping us actually being able to operationalize and put principles, for example, into practice. And so, Ryan, really excited to be here with you, and thank you for all the work that you do as well. So before I start, I do have a couple slides. Bear with me one quick second. I'm going to pull them up. And what I thought I would do is basically just start with a little bit of background and level set for everyone here in terms of the Joint AI Center, or the JAIC at the Department of Defense. So the JAIC was set up about 2 years ago, effectively, and their mandate was to really think about how we adopt and scale AI across the Department of Defense. I started at the JAIC in January of this year. I know it seems like forever ago, but I started in January of this year, and my role has been focused on taking the DOD AI Ethics Principles and putting them into practice. How do we actually implement them and to put them into practice and move from principles or aspirations to action, I should say. I will say, I'll caveat this, I am not an ethicist, so I do not have a philosophy background. I am coming to this conversation in this role with the lens of an engineer, technical lens, as well as a legal and business lens. Practiced law for a number of years, really focused on thinking through risk management issues, thinking through compliance, audit, and governance of organizational structures. And so my lens in terms of my role is really from that aspect. So I thought what I'd do is just share out a little bit more in terms of our journey. So the DOD has actually been on this AI ethics journey for about 2 years now. So it started in 2018 with our DOD AI strategy that was issued. And in there, one of the 5 pillars was identified explicitly as the need to lead in military ethics and AI safety. This was further reinforced in the National Defense Authorization Act in 2019. where the DOD was called on to really develop appropriate ethical, legal, and other policies as we think about AI technologies. And around the same time, the Defense Innovation Board had started their effort in developing principles for the DOD. And so they undertook a 15-month study, which was fairly robust. As you can see, they had a number of public listening sessions. They had a really broad group of multidisciplinary individuals, backgrounds at the table. So it wasn't just the technologists, but you had the lawyers, you had the ethicists, you had social scientists, you had the public, you had industry, you had academia, you had everyone at the table. And so that 15-month study was robust, transparent, and inclusive. And it culminated in a report that they issued in fall of 2019. So actually almost a little bit over a year ago, hard to believe, where they provided their principles and a fairly comprehensive report associated with how they had developed those principles. That report was considered by the DOD and was reviewed. The principles were reviewed, went through the internal review process at the DOD, and really became the foundation of the 5 principles that were adopted by Secretary Esper in February of this year. The JAIC, of course, in that memo that adopts the principles also was identified as the lead in coordinating the implementation and oversight of the principles themselves. So the 5 principles, the 5 DOD AI ethics principles are, as you can see on the left-hand side, responsible, equitable, traceable, reliable, and governable. And they've all been defined in more detail than what I am demonstrating on the slide, but of course, how do we actually take those words and those definitions and drill down into how they come to life in practice? But I will say first that these principles actually build on a long history of the DOD's work with respect to existing legal and ethical frameworks that are established within the organization. And when we look at these 5 principles themselves, many of them are actually grounded in good engineering practices, right? So for example, how are we ensuring fidelity of the data? Or if we think about the system, how are we ensuring the security and the safety of the system? Or are we testing in the appropriate manners? Are we testing for emergent behavior? Are we ensuring that the system can be governable? And while all of that in defining and adopting these practices is absolutely necessary, it's not sufficient. And so we actually need to think a little bit more broadly in terms of the infrastructure and the culture within an organization that can really sustain and support these practices, or tools that are developed to put these principles into practice. And so that's why we have at the DOD and at the JAIC, what we've been really doing is talking about it more broadly in the concept of responsible AI. So responsible AI, as we define it, really combines the technology, the culture, and the operating structure to ensure that the systems that we design, develop, deploy, and use are used and done so in a manner that increases the effectiveness of forces. We want to ensure that we are actually aiding and increasing the effectiveness, and also ensuring that we are empowering our AI developers and users to actually implement the principles while adhering to the history that the department has with respect to advancing its core values, thinking through law of war, and advancing, again, our nation's democratic values in a manner that is transparent and really is benefiting the society as a whole. And so as we think about this, the question is like, why is this important for the DOD, right? There's been a number of conversations, and I'm sure many of you have already have been in tune to many of these conversations, but like thinking through the fact that it is important for the US to establish global norms as it relates to responsible AI in defense applications. Thinking through how do we strengthen international partnerships by making sure that our allies have shared values in the application of AI, making sure that when it is time and necessary from an international and ally perspective that we are all aligned. We talk about interoperability in terms of technology, but we also need to think about interoperability as it relates to principles themselves. We also want to talk about responsible AI because it talks to how we give our service members confidence that the AI-enabled systems that are being fielded are trustworthy and reliable. And at the end of the day, trying to establish and earn the trust, engender the trust of the public and industry and the broader AI community to really sustain our technology edge. So how do we make this happen? Well, it requires an approach that we've sort of looked at from the lens of the necessity for it to be holistic. It has to be focused on integration, and it has to foster collaboration. Oftentimes when we talk about, or when I hear people talk about ethics, you know, sometimes they think about it as being a product and something that's tacked on at the end of a development cycle. And that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about a process, and we're talking about starting at the very beginning of the design phase, or even as soon as early as identifying a use case, for example. And so how do we put all of those sort of conceptual aspects into practice? And we are looking at it from the lens of 4 pillars of people, processes, partnerships, and policy. And if I break it down for a moment, when we think about people, what we're talking about is thinking through roles and responsibilities, thinking about training and education. And 2 quick examples I'll share with you that we've undertaken at the JAIC is we piloted a Responsible AI Champions program earlier this summer, where we took 15 cross-functional individuals across the JAIC, technologists, non-technologists, so folks from HR, folks from acquisition, folks from budgeting, and brought them together to really think through the principles. So it was a 9-week experiential course where we had instruction as well as breakout conversations. And in those conversations, there was a really ripe opportunity to think through how these principles would impact each of these individuals based on their roles, based on the organization, based on their functional areas as a group. And so that's one example. The other example that I'll share with you too is we recently issued a workforce education strategy for the DOD, and I think you'll be able to find information on both of these if you're interested on the JAIC website. But in that workforce education strategy, we talked about responsible AI and its need to be part of everyone's curriculum and understanding. So if I take a step back, this might be too much detail, but the workforce education strategy talks about a number of different archetypes. And the fact is that everyone has to have a baseline understanding of why this is an important topic, why we should be paying attention, how we need to start creating muscle memory around this. And so while the breadth and depth of the content or the curriculum may vary based on your specific role, the fact is everyone needs to have some form of awareness and education around this. The second pillar being processes. So thinking through what are tools and frameworks that we can utilize, that we need to develop perhaps, that can be leveraged in terms of the design, develop, deploy, and use phases of the technology. So sort of taking a systems approach or an end-to-end approach in terms of what do we need to think about, how can we actually embed and integrate it into existing workflows. So we don't want to create something from scratch, and we don't want to create something new. So if there's already, for example, existing processes, how can we build into those and tap into those? A couple quick examples I'll share with you on that is that we have started using data cards and model cards at the JAIC, and we've been able to test them out on certain projects and use those learnings to really inform where we go next with these tools and how they should be utilized and what kind of training might be needed or necessary around these tools. One of the things that I always say is the tools are fine. Tools in and of themselves are necessary, but really where it comes down to play is the assessment of the content of the tools, right? So like, how are we using that information? How are we ensuring that the right subject matter experts are around the table evaluating that information, asking the right questions, making decisions as required from the right mindset around whether it's a design or development, deployment aspects, and how are we documenting, for example, those decisions and creating that traceability that's necessary through the product lifecycle. So that's one aspect with respect to tools. Another is platforms. So right now, the JAIC is creating this joint common foundation, our cloud architecture in terms of where we're developing our DevSecOps pipeline. And so are there ways that we can integrate and embed ethics into that architecture? So again, trying to think about creatively how we can increase our muscle memory around thinking through these types of issues, increase adoption of tools in a seamless operational manner for individuals who are involved with the design and development of the technology. In terms of partnerships, so we've been working closely with our acquisition unit within the JAIC, thinking through how can we think through processes and implementation of these principles with our industry defense base. And so while we might have one definition of how a principle should be applied, the acquisition partner may have another definition. So how do we reconcile that? How do we bridge the gap? Again, like what does interoperability between practices and processes between two organizations look like? How do we ensure that the integrity of what we are expecting is what we're receiving? And so we are going down the path of really trying to be collaborative and working with our industry partners to figure this out together. This isn't, I probably should have prefaced my comments with the fact like what we are talking about here is not just a JAIC issue, it's not just a government issue, it's not just an industry issue, right? Like this is an issue that impacts basically everyone. And so we need to figure this out collectively in a manner, in a fashion that works for all of us to really ensure that we are doing this in the best manner possible. Another partnership piece that I will also share out is in September, we had our first inaugural AI Partnership for Defense convening where there were 13 nations at the table. Their defense institutions were at the table where we really focused on responsible AI. So just like we're talking about this and the need for us to collaborate with our acquisition partners, for example, on this, it's just as important for us to start having these conversations with our allies and our like-minded partners at the table. There's also partnership opportunities as we think about across the government, and so working with various other agencies and subject matter experts as well. And then lastly, policy. So how do we think through policy in terms of trying to move the needle on this? And I will share with all of you to change culture, right? One way to do it is to really think about processes and using policy perhaps as a vehicle to sort of encourage the adoption in a more effective or quicker manner. But I think as we think about responsible AI, which impacts an organizational in a more broader sense, when we're thinking about having the necessary infrastructure to actually implement some of these tools that we're talking about, it may not be so easy to jump to policy. And so some of my conversations that I've been having across the DOD has really opened my eyes to recognizing that some of the foundational pieces need to be addressed. So thinking through what is the level of responsible AI literacy across the organization. So what is that maturity level of understanding? Are we all at the same page? Are we all using the same common vocabulary or language around some of these issues? Or do these areas within the DoD have the appropriate resources and subject matter expertise at hand to even leverage some of these tools that we might be talking about? And so all of these sort of pieces have to be done in tandem, and all the dots are connected. And so thinking through how can we use policy as a way or a vehicle to make all of that happen, and or are we thinking about existing policies that might actually be acting as barriers for us to be able to move forward with AI and its adoption? And so thinking through perhaps revisiting existing policies to break down some of those barriers. We are, in terms of our next steps at the JAIC, really thinking through hard and thoughtfully in terms of what does our actual implementation strategy and roadmap look like? And some of the things I'll just share with you all as well is we've learned that we need to look at this as a phased approach. And so while we may know the answers and we may know all the tools and we're ready to go, we need to bring the organization with us. And so how can we sort of phase and scaffold our approach in trying to really maximize adoption and implementation of responsible AI? We also recognize that the fact that even as we talk about these 4 pillars, given the breadth of the DOD, frankly, we need to ensure that there is some form of centralized alignment so that we are all working from the same standard, so to speak, or same vision, while still allowing for the services, for example, to have the autonomy to be able to execute per their respective resources and structures and processes. And so that's been another thing that's been at top of mind for us. And then the last 2 pieces I'll just share as well is the fact that all of this, again, we're doing this through a risk management lens and thinking through at every single stage, what are the potential risks? How can we mitigate the risks? And or reevaluating it, frankly, through the entire development, deployment, and use phase, because as these technologies learn, the outputs or the performance may change. And so how are we monitoring those aspects once the technology is actually deployed? And so how do we, again, bring that risk management lens to the fact that when we think about deployment and use, or development, deployment, and use, there's sort of this iterative feedback cycle that is constantly occurring, and how do we tap in as we think about it from a responsible AI perspective? And of course, and I know I didn't necessarily highlight this in the process section, but or process pillar, but a key piece to this all is thinking through governance and escalation. And what do those paths need to look like from an organizational perspective, but also within the various services and components within the DOD. And so I know I've kind of shared a lot there. Hopefully some of that resonated with all of you. I think this is definitely a journey. We are all figuring this out together, and it's in all of our best interests to collaborate, frankly, on this. And again, like with Ryan and organizations like his, I think it's important that they continue to sort of push forward with their work to provide us with tools to start with and to integrate within our organizations as we go on our journey. So I will stop there. Tom, I'll hand it back over to you.
That was fantastic. We have somebody that raised their hand in the audience.
Oops.
We don't want to let that question go to waste. We can actually promote somebody to ask the question as well. There we go. Mitchell? Do you want to ask a question?
That must have been an accident. Sorry.
Okay. Well, welcome anyway. So Alka, a lot of progress this year. I've seen a lot of progress from you. What do you think, what are your main things you're going to really try to work on in 2021? Where do you kind of see the future there?
Yeah, so great question. So we're hoping to finalize our responsible AI strategy and implementation plan that we will be producing for early 2021 that we will provide across the DoD. So the services have sort of a roadmap to look to, recognizing that, again, like this document is going to be flexible, will need to be updated every so often. So that's definitely one piece. And then we are definitely working towards thinking through policy recommendations, actual policy recommendations as we go forward after this document. So that is definitely top of mind. The other piece too is as we develop these tools that I was mentioning, a lot of our effort is actually testing them out and having use cases across the DoD for us to test them out. Again, we don't want to do this in a vacuum, and we want to use those learnings to actually help us with our policy recommendations and so forth. So right now, those are the two critical pieces, and of course, within that implementation plan and strategy is a focus on how do we think about our risk management practices? How do we think about governance? How do we think about embedding the expertise within product teams? And how do we create this network of responsible AI champions through training and education? So hoping to tackle all of that as soon as possible.
Yes, is that all? Big 2021, I foresee.
Yeah.
We've got a couple questions. How does T&E integrate with or support with ethics? Is T&E...
Yes, that's a great question. So
Okay.
I don't know if you've all heard or had a chance to hear Dr. Jane Pinnell speak. She is our chief of T&E at the JAIC. She and I work hand in hand. And so, you know, she talks about using testing as a way to test for implementation around the principles. I definitely think there's opportunities, and not just in T&E, right? But like from the very beginning, as we think about the data aspect and all aspects, but the fact of, again, integrating and embedding some of these tools and practices within a test harness is something that she and I are talking about. Like, how can we think about looking at data for bias and representativeness and sort of embedding some of these requirements within a test harness going forward. So T&E is definitely a critical aspect to making some of this happen. Again, I talk about ethics being a process, not a product. So it's not, this fits into every part of that AI product lifecycle, and definitely with T&E as well.
That's actually a really good idea. So we have a very sprawling enterprise here at ATARC, but in our data and analytics, our AI data analytics group, we have a lab concept that is, we just talked about last on Friday. I think whatever we do, I think we ought to look at ethics and have that as an overlay, you know, on our use cases that we're looking at. I think that's a great idea. Great question. Another question: do you foresee RAI as being a compliance requirement in the future, somehow implemented like 508 or other compliance initiatives to require some proof of our AI consideration activities?
So I'm really careful about not necessarily tying responsible AI to compliance, right? Like, this is not a compliance function. This is broader than that. Yeah. I do think there are processes that should be developed and are required as we think about what it means to demonstrate responsible AI or implement the 5 principles specifically, whether it's through those good engineering practices. So, and I think that probably is a great question for Ryan too, given the work that he's doing.
I think that's our setup question, right?
That's right. That's right. So maybe I'll turn it over.
Yeah. Yep. Thank you, Alka, for that.
Sure.
Just hang on in case we have any more questions, if you don't mind.
Absolutely.
But I definitely want to turn over the program to Ryan Carrier, who gave me one of the more interesting presentations, and hopefully he'll live up to the hype with here at ATARC. I think you've really looked at this problem, and he represents a nonprofit organization called ForHumanity. How are you doing today, Ryan?
I'm great, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and literally a perfect segue question. I can't. You know.
and where you? You're up in the Midwest somewhere, right, Ryan?
No, based out of Armonk, New York. The global headquarters of IBM is how some people often know Armonk, about 45 minutes north of the city.
No, fantastic, fantastic. Well, I'm going to turn the program over to you, and I'm sure we'll have some questions once you get through. Thank you.
Great, my pleasure, and thanks to Alka for a perfect setup, and I'm very much looking forward to working together with Alka, and thanks to ATARC and Kirsten and Tom for having me today. As Tom mentioned, we are a 501c3. It's a nonprofit that's been around for about 4 years, and I started it and founded it personally because I was looking at the impact of AI and automation on the future of my kids. And I'll just be very honest with you, I was scared, not because we're opposed to technology in any way. It's because everything was being pushed as a positive solution. And I had a 25-year finance career built in risk management, and we recognize that there's always downside risk associated with all of these tools. And I just didn't feel that the industry or really anyone was looking sufficiently at those downside risks. And so I felt compelled to launch ForHumanity. We've done this pro bono for 4 years now. And the mission is very simple: to look at and analyze these risks and then try to find a way to mitigate them. And so thinking about this infrastructure of trust that we need to build into our autonomous systems, coming from my finance background, we actually have a very, very robust infrastructure of trust, which is founded in financial accounting, where for the last 50 years, we've practiced this relationship between companies and their independent auditor, verifying, assuring compliance with a set of rules. And that set of rules, it's almost global. We've got GAAP accounting in the US, we've got IFRS most of the way around the world, and they're very similar. And so we really do have this universal or standard set. Now, it's easier when you're dealing with numbers and sort of the implications from tax code and so on. But that infrastructure of trust, when in finance, when we take those numbers, when we deal with financially accounted numbers, we trust them implicitly. We rarely think to question them. And even if we do, we're having a little quibble about a known gray area. And we need to get to that same level of trust with our autonomous systems, whether it's AI or autonomous systems. And so we want to borrow from that experience, and we want to bring it into this lens. And so the work that ForHumanity does is we are looking at all autonomous systems that impact humans in any of these 5 categories: privacy, bias, ethics, cybersecurity, and trust. And we don't have to formally define amongst those 5 categories. What we want to do is use this as our lens to see where humans are impacted with these systems. So for example, if you've built a stock picking system that doesn't touch a human, doesn't use human related data, it falls out of our system. It's not what we're worried about. Our work, and thus this name, this sort of silly and hyperbolic and audaciously dreamy name of ForHumanity, that's where it comes from, is we want to make sure we know who we are serving with the work that we're doing. And so some of you, and certainly what the DOD's already done is a perfect example. There's lots of work in responsible AI and AI ethics in these frameworks, guidelines, all around the world. And they've massively improved our awareness of these issues and challenges. But for me, I always had to get down to an implementable level. How do we take these concepts and turn them into compliance or build them into the system? Alka verged on a term that I love and I use all the time, which is, can we get to a place of compliance by design, where it's built in the process from the very beginning, that we're achieving all of these very positive things, very supporting of positive human interaction with these tools? Can we build them into the process from the beginning? And so the step that we take that's most relevant is that we are building a set of audit rules. So we have a team of over 130 contributors, 23 fellows, 130 contributors, all volunteer. This has all happened in the last 6 months. And in those 6 months, we've already drafted 3,000 audit rules covering, and I'll show you some of these as examples, but starting from the top down of organizations. So questions for the board, questions for the CEO, questions for the chief data officer. But then below that, we start to go function by function. So we're building audits out on a function by function basis, on an AI by AI basis, on an autonomous system by autonomous system basis. And every one of the questions that we're asking meets the criteria that you see here on the screen. Every question is binary, compliant or not compliant. They're fully measurable and unambiguous. They're fully implementable. They're consensus driven. We don't do, and well, what a perfect timing to say what I usually say here, which is we don't do 51-49 majority, we just fought over it kind of things like we're living through right now with who the next president will be. We look for rules that are consensus driven. The vast majority of us recognize that these are important rules for us to be following with our systems or embedded in our systems. So our work is consensus driven. It is 100% transparent. Anyone can participate in the process. It's collaborative and iterative. We go through it on and on all the time, and then we have a system for maintaining it once the audit rules are kind of set. There's still a process for keeping them current and ongoing with a very changing and dynamic marketplace. And the work that we do is crowdsourced. So audits are drafted and then the crowd pours over them. And we've seen the power of this from an approach. We started out with a different approach. The original approach, and I was just wrong about this, it was naive, and I've apologized to our contributors because I wasted some of their time, was that we would curate a dialogue. So we'd bring the experts to the table and curate the dialogue. We started this actually with digital contact tracing. And when we did the process, we got 5 rules. It took us about 10 days. So maybe 10 years from now, we might have a decent audit for digital contact tracing for you. It just wasn't going to work. And so a team of the people who I brought in, they all pulled me aside and they said, Ryan, just write the rules yourself. I was like, me? What do I have to, it's not for me to say. And I said, no, that's not the point. You could write perfect rules. I could write perfect rules for the DOD. If nobody pays any attention to them, if nobody pores over them, if nobody examines them word for word, line by line, definition by definition, it doesn't matter. So I said, all right, I'll give it a try. 5 days later, I produced 238 audit rules for digital contact tracing. And that's when the magic happened. Because this entire team of people, and you can go to our website to see the list of fellows and contributors who are doing this work, and anyone can join. So, you're welcome to do so as well. They poured over this audit. And again, they went word by word, line by line. We have an entire set of definitions where we agree the terminology the same as you would for contract law. So we speak the same lexicon, and for the needs of the JAIC and the DOD, we create that normalization, right? We create a set of audit rules and a process whereby all defense contractors can pour in over top of this. The JAIC and elements of the DOD can pour in over on this so that the rules that we're creating meet the needs of the community. And we will balance that from our point of view and our mission-driven approach of ensuring that humanity and the humans that all these systems impact are cared for in that process, because that's our mission and that's who we are. Along those lines, after meeting with Alka and other members of the JAIC it's a little over a month ago, they asked us to respond to their Tradewind RFI. And so we did on October 9th, and we were approved a few days later to be a trusted ecosystem partner. And I'll be honest, I don't know what that means yet, but we're still figuring it out. But I think what it means is that we will work together to try to achieve all of those amazing and important goals that Alka laid out. And we will bring our process and our system to bear to help achieve that goal. I just want to show you one other thing really quickly, which is I want to give you just a little taste of what the audit looks like. And so again, anyone who joins ForHumanity, and all that means is you're registering on our website and you're agreeing to be a good boy or girl in the discussions, right? What you do is you're welcomed into the community where we talk about this, but you're also welcomed directly into this work here, which is the audit itself. And so what you're looking at here is an entire page of definitions, and you can see we've already got 62 comments built into this all throughout, where we're editing and iterating each of these. And one of the things that I wanted to show you in specific, and this is as much for Alka as it is for anybody else, which is this is our section on algorithmic risk and how we're building in compliance by design. So our audit process is demanding risk mitigation, documentation, disclosure, and transparency around all of these key issues like non-response bias, statistical bias, cognitive bias, component risk, concept drift, consent risk, a whole section on data ethics, the use of inferences and proxy variables, and then blending that into Dr. Jane Pinellas's work. We also require things like reliability tests, validity tests, and regular testing frequency, all built into a system that is meant to be audited by a third-party auditor. So my dream for everything that we're doing here is that we get all defense contractors on the same page in terms of these rules. And when the JAIC through the Tradewind or any other part of the DOD wants to acquire an AI or autonomous system, they're arriving compliant with this responsible AI needs principles as laid out and agreed upon in these rules with third-party audits attached. Someone has already gone through and verified compliance with all of these lines of audit. And the other thing that I'll show you, so we're building this out on an economy-wide basis, so it's really a massive kind of project. We've started in the financials category, and I'll wrap up here, but what I want to give you an idea very quickly is scope. So for example, we have a whole set of questions for the board of directors, a whole set of questions for the chief executive officer, and a whole set of questions for the chief data officer. So these three positions apply to the whole of the firm. And then once we get below these audit questions, we're now going to go autonomous system by autonomous system. So for example, under the COO, we've got an entire audit, 135 lines, just on schedules and calendars. We do the same thing for contact database. I'm just take this in for scope. You don't need to know what's here. You're welcome to come in and look at it. We got to do contact database. We've got to do internal chats. And just picture this for a defense contractor or the different AIs that the JAIC needs to require. We're going to go through and we're going to identify, and this is what's undone, right? For the COO, we haven't done events in large groups, record keeping, property management, corporate travel, mailroom, on and on. And then I could keep doing this, right? I've got the chief financial officer and I've got a whole set of things to do. Chief technology officer, whole set of things to do. We've done HR. We've done recommendation systems. We're drafting drones, a drones audit just now. The other big piece of work that we're doing, so we're obviously starting to work with the JAIC. We've been brought in by the ICO, which is the UK regulator for really these kind of issues. And they're responsible for GDPR and GDPR compliance. And I don't know if you've seen it, but they're dropping massive fines on pretty much everyone because they are not GDPR compliant. And they've asked us to provide a GDPR certification scheme. So we're basically going through for them, codifying the law into a set of audit rules. And all we want to be is the rule-making body. What we want to do then is license auditors, license service providers, and other groups to solve these problems in practicality. And we'll do our job and maintain this set of rules, whether it's for the JAIC, DOD, ICO, the world. You know, we're not shy. We're very ambitious in what we want to cover. But we really do think if we can codify these rules the way that GAAP and IFRS were codified in '73, they were quickly adopted. The SEC and regulators around the world mandated that all publicly traded companies had to follow these rules. And we've had a great 50-year run, 99.9% of the time. And even the big explosions have proved the model of independent oversight. So take Enron and WorldCom. Enron and WorldCom, famous financial accounting disasters. But it actually proves the model because the company had to conspire with their auditor to achieve the frauds that they did. And so you can never build a foolproof system. Fraud and malfeasance can always defeat your system if it's a transparent system, if the rules are laid out, right? This is about willful compliance and wanting to provide responsible AI in the infrastructure by design from the outset. And that's the system we hope to create. And yes, it's massively ambitious, and I don't care. So I hope that helps you understand what we're trying to do and what we're trying to build. Maybe some of you are inspired to come along and join. I hope so. And I welcome your questions now.
Yeah. Brian and Alka, you're welcome to ask any questions that you'd like as well. But we've got one from the audience. With regard to public trust, is financial accounting an accurate comparable? Or wouldn't the nuclear power industry be a closer example of an industry trying to gain public trust? I don't know. I don't know if I want to be compared to the nuclear power industry, but wasn't that the case? It was in accounting that I didn't know where I stood financially because everybody else had different rules. Maybe add a little color to the history of where we were. We kind of take it for granted now with CPAs and generally accepted rules.
Well, that's exactly it. And it used to be a game. It used to be that there were rules that were accepted. You know, one school taught this system, another school taught this system, and then companies would game those systems. And that happened for, you know, we had financial accounting standards, but they were never normalized, nor were they required. Required is a big thing right here. When it's voluntary compliance, you're either compliant or you're playing games, right? You're doing whatever you need to do to achieve your mission. So when the industry came together, created gap accounting in '73, the government embraced it really quickly, right? The SEC mandated everybody's going to follow gap. And what that creates is that level playing field. You know that everybody is complying with the same set of rules, not always in the same way. There are gray areas. So I'm not saying it's a perfect system, but what it does is it builds that baseline so that we're all talking the same language. We all have the same normative expectations. And then we can do proper evaluation on the merits of the system, not on the merits of compliance. And so it's a huge step forward in terms of just even the evaluation process. So Tom, I hope that you feel that answers the question.
No, I think so. I think like for the nuclear power industry, they had 3 Mile Island, and then, you know, we had a couple disasters there. Hopefully we won't have these same disasters with AI ethics.
We will, because fraud and malfeasance will always be there. There will be people who choose to be bad actors, right? And so but we will identify those more quickly, and we will get more compliance by design by more willing participants. And so, you know, unfortunately, that's the world we live in. You know, the entire world agreed that we shouldn't gene edit babies. The entire world, everyone agreed it. And yet a researcher in China and a researcher in Rice chose to go and do it. When it comes to the advancement of technology, we have an autocracy, right? You can just do it. And if it's cool enough, people will adopt it. Best we can do is identify compliance by design, but we have one hammer, and that is if the DOD and the JAIC say these are our rules, well, guess what? You're not getting in the door unless you've complied.
We've got another question, and it's, you could just input any technology, any security or technology. Are you concerned that auditing and governance being discussed will eliminate small businesses from participating because of compliance?
You want to take that first, Alka?
Go ahead, Alka.
Sure. Yeah, no, that is an absolutely great question. It's something I think about all the time, frankly, especially from an acquisition perspective, right? Like to Brian's point, like if the DOD and JAIC comes out with certain rules in terms of what our expectation is around implementation of these principles, I am the first to raise the fact that, you know, these big tech companies that have wonderful resources and can comply or meet the requirements that we might issue at some point, is one thing, but the impact of that is leaving out the startups, the companies that don't have the resources. And now we've just like, it's a catch-22. Like we want those startups and we want the diverse voices at the table. And just because they don't have the resources should not be a reason to penalize or not have them included in the process. So to answer that question, I focus on, I'm trying to approach that question by really being collaborative with our industry base in a diverse fashion so that all the voices are at the table. So as we build out our requirements, we are being very thoughtful not to exclude either small or unique type of entities that are not typical government contractors. Because I think for us to do this and for us to do this right, especially with AI, we need to have those smaller organizations at the table with us just as much as perhaps the larger ones. And so I'm hoping with Project Tradewind that Ryan was referring to, that's our acquisition efforts. One of the goals of that project is to have a consortium of industry and academia. And we are being very intentional to make sure that it is a diverse group of organizations from industry. So it isn't just one-sided to the big tech companies, but rather the smaller organizations and maybe non-tech companies who are in the space, right? And so really trying to be inclusive around that.
And
I think we've learned, go ahead, Ryan.
Sorry, I was just going to say, and we face the same challenge, right? Which is why I refer to when we're seeking legal mandate, we're seeking it for large publicly traded companies. However, let's take that GDPR example. if you're a two-person shop and you're dealing in personal data with a European data subject, you are subject to GDPR. There's just no two ways around it. So there's certain levels of qualification and normalization that will have to be met. And Alka's approach is exactly right, whereby you want to tailor it so that you're doing smart things that mitigate risks across all of your systems, but at the same time is allowing for moms and pops and SMEs and the small academic approaches, but while they're still being responsible. That's the key.
And I think we've learned from FedRAMP and other things, if we can get the automation done as early as possible, some kind of automation, ATO. I mean, shoot, we're dealing with AI, and we ought to be able to automate a lot of this compliance. And then the earlier the roadmap comes out there, then I'm building my products with this in mind, the less rework that you have to do. Just like the Silicon Valley company having to do security in our space. Boy, you know what? It'd be great if you knew that from the ground up, and you'd be thinking more of the security. So maybe we can get bigger companies, small companies, everybody kind of thinking about ethics right away. It'll be a lot less than having to rework your whole stack later.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I will share a year or so ago, I was involved with an organization, like an incubator with like small startups. And we actually at that point started having these conversations. So, they didn't grow so big so fast that then they realized, oh, we have to address AI ethics and we need to go back and restructure and figure out our processes. And so to your point, like, the earlier these conversations as these organizations are forming happen, the better. And I did want to just quickly circle back, if you don't mind, Tom, real quick on the compliance question too. While we're talking about ethics and compliance, I don't want to lose the sight that like we are moral agents, right? Like we hold the sort of the key in terms of determining what we should or should not, or what we ought to do. And so while we can talk about processes and compliances, which is a complementary necessity, right, in terms of these processes or in terms of implementation, I don't want us to lose sight that we all have a responsibility. And this is something I try to impart across the DOD, is like, regardless of your role, regardless of whether you're a technologist or not a technology, we all have an obligation. We know what's right and we know what's wrong. And so, or we know that we should be raising or asking questions. And so we shouldn't just be sort of quiet observers as this technology is being built or developed. So as soon as a use case is identified, like, we have a gut feeling if something doesn't sound right. And so it's incumbent on us to really raise those issues. And I think that's where, the whole ethics questions of whether or not we should do something or ought to do something needs to be embraced. Oh, Tom, I think you're on mute.
Well, the first one of the webinars I did a while ago, I did that for like 3 minutes and was wondering why nobody was getting back to me. So that's a mild mistake compared to my normal bonehead moves. Any final thoughts before we're done today?
There's one other question that came in.
Okay. Oh yeah, I just saw that.
Yeah, it just came in.
Do you think the United States government will subsidize the small business cost for building and compliance while developing an AI solution as such for an OTA? I think possibly, right? What do you think, Alka?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good question. One of the things I think about is, can we coordinate a little bit better across the government in regards to like doing something like that, right? Like I know while some agencies can sort of approach it, independently, I'm just wondering if there's an opportunity for us to sort of think about this holistically, because it's going to be a question that all of our agencies are facing, frankly, to a certain degree, as we think about engaging with other companies.
Well, I think that's where Tradewin can really, and for those of you, we'll send out a link for this Tradewin. It's basically an OTA that's going to nonprofits. We know about it. We're a nonprofit. and we're working with Ryan's group on that. You know, the idea would be to have this business manager that coordinates all the services. And so like an OTA, that'd be a great example of, you know, I have some new technology. I need to federalize it or make it DOD grade, but I got to get the ethics in there too. That is, I think you know, that's why you have an OTA. You know, you're taking commercial technology and integrating it in the DOD, and this is how you do it. So I think that's definitely a serious option.
And I'll just share real briefly too, Tom, just to sort of piggyback with Tradewin, we were intentional about including language around responsible AI within the RFI, and sort of raising that issue as we go through the selection process or review process, as it may be.
Yep. And I think we just addressed one more question about where to find Ryan and ForHumanity. So I think you addressed that. Anyway, this has been a great discussion. I can't believe an hour went by so quick. Thank you both, Alka and Ryan, for doing this. I think we're going to continue the conversation. It's not the first time we're going to do this. It's not the last time, that's for sure. This is going to be an ongoing discussion as long as we have AI, I believe. But thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you for having us.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks.
Thank you to everybody. Thank you, Kirsten, and thank you for everybody to hang on here. And I think you got a lot out of this. I hope. So thank you.
Thank you.